thank you for inviting me to talk. It's a bit too early, really, to make any sort of definitive assessment of what is going on, because it's still going on, and it's not clear how it will evolve. What will be the extent of, let us say, other factors, other players in this saga. For example, whether Hezbollah will join the fight or not. I mean, they've made a sort of they've signaled their support, of course, for the Hamas onslaught on Israeli colonialism, and but whether they'll get properly involved, heavily involved, it remains open. So it's not clear also how Israel, how far Israel will go in its revenge. It's going to be dire, but how far it will go, whether it will actually try to occupy the Gaza Strip. I mean, all these are open questions, and so excuse me if my comments will be somewhat disorganized and not crystallized. It's too early to make, as I said, to make a definitive assessment of this attack of the Hamas resistance against Israeli colonialism. What we can say is that it was both not only predictable, but predicted, not least by me, as well as by others, and at the same time unexpected. I tried to explain in what sense it was predicted and predictable and predicted, and in what sense it was unexpected. I've been saying, I think, in this forum as well as in others, in print and orally in this specific forum, that things are actually escalating. The oppression of Zionist colonialism against the Palestinian people is intensifying, and with it, in reaction to it, also acts of resistance, both organized and disorganized. Each, of course, feeding the other. The only way in which this Israeli colonial regime is conceives of reacting to Palestinian resistance is harsher oppression. And of course, harsher oppression feeds resistance. And this goes on where it is finally leading to, whether there's any exit from this cycle, is something that I'll return to later. There is a possible culmination of this because it is not a symmetric conflict. It is highly asymmetric, and Israel holds much more power and much more ability to steer eventually the culmination of this conflict in the way that Zionism has always eventually and potentially aimed for, and that is get rid of as many Palestinians as possible and occupy as much of the territory of Palestine as possible. In other words, ethnic cleansing. But this is not yet on the immediate agenda. There have been steps towards it. So the escalation of the colonial conflict was predicted, and it was also predicted, and by various people, including myself, that one of the focal points of the conflagration will be the holy place, the holy places, especially the Al-Aqsa compound in Jerusalem, which is not only a religious compound, but it has very strong symbolic value for most Palestinians, whether they're Muslims or not. It includes Palestinians who are Christian or don't, not affiliated to any religion whatsoever. I want to quote from an article that I published in Weekly Worker on 9th of November. Sorry, 19th of January, sorry, Weekly Worker of 19th of January. The third and final way in which escalation, that's a quote, the third and final way in which escalation is going to occur in the occupied territories is through religious provocation. And here I'm talking about incursions into the holy places, especially Al-Haram al-Sharif, known to Jews as Temple Mount, the mountain on which the Mosque of Al-Aqsa is situated. This is a focus of provocation. Not for nothing have these fanatics in the new Israeli cabinet been dubbed incendiaries or pyromaniacs. They are out to make deliberate provocation calculated to heighten tension and to increase conflict in the occupied territories and beyond. I do not need to tell you that a major provocation on Temple Mount will have repercussions not only in Palestine, but in the entire Muslim world. Here then is a possible point of ignition of the conflict, which is going to go beyond the confines of Israel-Palestine. Indeed, it is not insignificant that Hamas has named its current Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. So it is connecting its onslaught on Israeli colonialism as connected directly with Al-Aqsa. It is responding, among other things, to provocations that were deliberately mounted by the Messianic Zionists in the present Israeli cabinet. Ben Gvir, especially, should be mentioned. He made deliberate provocative incursions into Al-Aqsa with the, I think, deliberate intention of intensifying the conflict. He is interested in driving the conflict to higher and higher levels with the intention ultimately of bringing it to its ultimate conclusion by ethnic cleansing, in other words, another Nakba. On its side, Hamas is interested in stressing the Al-Aqsa aspect of its onslaught, its connection to this provocation, because in this way it is hoping to gain support beyond the confines of Palestine and beyond even the immediate Middle East, but throughout the Muslim world. Mentioning of Al-Aqsa, I think, is deliberate on both sides. In an even more technical sense, the present onslaught, the present attack of Hamas against Israel, the colonial regime of Israel, was actually predicted by the Israeli defense forces itself. Not many years ago, in fact, I think, what was it? 7 years ago, in 2016, there was an IDF exercise. The Israeli military conducted an exercise that assumed a scenario which is very similar to what occurred currently. That is to say, incursion of Hamas militants by land, sea, and air into Israel, and attacks of a similar nature, perhaps not quite in the same scope of what is currently taking place, but of a broadly similar nature. So it was predicted, not only predictable, yet it caught Israel completely by surprise. And it has been not unreasonably compared by quite a few commentators, in several commentators, to the surprise that Israel fell into exactly 50 years and 1 day previously. That is to say, in the 6th of November, of October 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Again, on that occasion, the possibility of Egyptian attack in crossing the Suez Canal was predicted. It was predictable because Israel rejected Anwar Sadat's attempts to conduct talks about the future of the Sinai Peninsula, then occupied by Israel. Israel contemptuously rejected these attempts, and it was clear that the only remaining option for Egypt was to try to do it by military force, which it did. But on both occasions, the surprise was occasioned by hubris. The Israeli leadership is victims of its own hubris and its own racism, which tells it that the bloody Arabs are too primitive and too incapable of doing anything on this scale. As a matter of fact, in the recent weeks, the dismal failure of Israel to prepare and react in time to the crossing of the Suez Canal in 1973 has been broadly discussed because, according to the 50-year rule, various documents relating to that period have become released, if only in a very redacted form. So the failure of Israel to expect this attack was widely discussed in the Israeli press recently. And they even speculated what happens if we repeat this mistake. Well, they bloody well repeated it. So that is one point that needs stressing. A recent article in Haaretz has enumerated the points which encapsulated the lack of readiness or the failure of the Israeli establishment to prepare for a Hamas onslaught. The author mentions 6 points. The article is headed, "Why Israel Defenses Crumbled in Face of Hamas Assault." That is an article, I think, today, in today's Haaretz. First of all, no intelligence warning. This is the major failure. Israel has an extensive network of both personal intelligence, that is to say, spies and people planted in the occupied territories, as well as surveillance operators unequaled in any unequaled in any country. The kind of surveillance that supposedly allows it to locate every mouse, not only every person, every mouse in the territories under its occupation, including the Gaza concentration camp. And yet, Hamas conducted an operation that obviously needed months to prepare. It wasn't something that could have been cooked up in a few days. It must have taken months to prepare, involving at the very least some hundreds of people, because the people who are actually mobilized to cross the separation border must have known about it, including some senior planners, etc., etc. And yet, Israeli intelligence knew nothing about it. That is a failure of the legendary Israeli intelligence services. So this is point number one. Secondly, logistic failure. The Israeli army took a long time to realize the magnitude of the event. Even when it started, intelligence that they had about what is currently happening was faulty. That's point number two. Logistically, faulty troop transport preparations. There were no adequate preparations to transport troops. Why they needed to transport? They had quite a few ground forces mobilized at the time, but not in the right place. I'll come to the next in a moment to the reason where they were actually deployed. So there were faulty troop transport preparation. Once the troops were brought south, the next point was they had to wait for long hours at the gathering points to be deployed to where they were needed. And the sixth point is that, again, a fault not only of intelligence gathering, but intelligence assessment. And that is, as in the Yom Kippur War, senior security establishment brass estimated that the rival, in this case Hamas, isn't really interested in immediately starting a war. So all these points are a matter of dismal failure. This is a main point in the internal Israeli comments about the current war, even while it is going on. I'll come to that later, in a moment, actually. if you really want to have any idea what is going on, the mainstream media is not a place to look at. I mean, their reporting is hopelessly skewed in favor of Israel and against Hamas. For example, you get the idea that Hamas is only killing civilians. I mean, they stress it is true that Hamas is engaged also in killing a lot of ordinary civilians, but a major part of its operation is a clash with Israeli forces, in which they have been fairly successful so far. This you don't get from the mainstream media here. So the assessment of Israeli, at least the Israeli liberal press, and I'm referring especially to Haaretz, is that at this stage, it is a major success for Hamas. I'm quoting from, again, today's Haaretz, an article by Chaim Levinson. The title is, "Whatever happens in this round of the Israel-Gaza war, we already lost. We, Israel, already lost. Whatever Israel does," I'm quoting, "whatever Israel does from this point onward is meaningless, even if it finds Mohammed Deif, the military leader of Hamas, in his bunker and brings him to trial in the People's Court. As in Yom Kippur War, the loss came with the opening blow. The rest are stories for historians." So the very fact that Hamas managed to make this onslaught is already a defeat for Israel. And who is responsible? Well, in today's, I must actually quote at length today's editorial of Haaretz. The disaster, so I'm quoting from today's Haaretz editorial, the disaster that befell Israel on the holiday of Simchat Torah, that was yesterday, is the clear responsibility of one person, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, who has prided himself on his vast political experience and irreplaceable wisdom in security matters, completely failed to identify the dangers he was consciously leading Israel into when establishing a government of annexation and dispossession, when appointing Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir to key positions, while embracing a foreign policy that openly ignores the existence and rights of Palestinians. Netanyahu will certainly try to evade his responsibility and cast the blame on the heads of the army, military intelligence, and the Shin Bet security services, who, like their predecessors on the eve of Yom Kippur War, saw a low probability of war, with their preparations for Hamas attack proving flawed. They scorned the enemy and its offensive military capability. Over the next days and weeks, when the depths of Israel Defense Forces and intelligence failures come to light, a justified demand to replace them and take stock will surely arise. However, the military and intelligence failures does not absolve Netanyahu of his overall responsibility for the crisis, as he is the ultimate arbiter of Israel's foreign and security affairs. Netanyahu is no novice in this role, like Ehud Olmert was in the Second Lebanon War, nor is he ignorant of military matters, as Golda Meir in 1973 and Menachem Begin in 1982 claimed to be. These were previous failures of Israel. 1982 was a failure against Hezbollah, or against in Lebanon. Netanyahu also shaped the policy embraced by the short-lived government of change led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, a multi-dimensional effort to crush the Palestinian national movement in both its wings, in Gaza and the West Bank, at a price that would seem acceptable to the Israeli public. In the past, Netanyahu marketed himself as a cautious leader who eschewed the wars and multiple casualties on Israel's side. After his victory in the last elections, he replaced this caution with a policy of fully right-wing government, with overt steps taken to annex the West Bank, to carry out ethnic cleansing in part of the Oslo-defined Area C, including the Hebron Hills and the Jordan Valley. This also included a massive expansion of settlements and bolstering of the Jewish presence in Temple Mount, near the Al-Aqsa Mosque, as well as boasts of an impending peace deal with Saudis in which the Palestinians would get nothing, with open talk of a secure second Nakba in his governing coalition. As expected, signs of an outbreak of hostilities began in the West Bank, where Palestinians started feeling the heavier hand of the Israeli occupier. Hamas exploited the opportunity in order to launch its surprise attack on Saturday. Above all, the danger looming over Israel in recent years has been fully realized. A prime minister indicted in 3 corruption cases cannot look after the state affairs, as national interests will necessarily be subordinate to extricating him from a possible conviction and jail time. This was the reason for establishing this horrific coalition and the judicial coup advanced by Netanyahu, and for the establishment of the top army and intelligence officers who were perceived as political opponents, and for the enfeeblement of top army and intelligence officers who were perceived as political opponents. The price was paid by the victims of the invasion in the Western Negev. Okay, what is a reasonable prediction of what is going to unfold in the immediate future? The failure of Israel to prepare for the Yom Kippur War, the surprise attack that was in that case predictable but unexpected, led to the downfall of the then government headed by Golda Meir. This was actually the end of the period of dominance of the Israeli Labor Party in Israeli politics. The Israeli leaders then were sufficiently, let us say, civilized to some extent to realize that this kind of failure must result in resignation. You know, we are talking about the 1970s, where both in Israel and in this country, political failure on a major scale led to the resignation of the responsible minister. This is not what is the current practice today, certainly not in the case of Netanyahu. There is not the slimmest chance that Netanyahu will resign willingly as a result of his individual failure. I should also mention that a point which I mentioned before, and I forgot to come back to it, but now I will mention it. I said before that there were substantial Israeli forces mobilized at the time of the incursion, but they were not in the south. Where were they? They were protecting pogromchiks, settlers who were engaged in conducting pogroms against Palestinian villages and towns much further north, and in protecting demonstrative and provocative settlers' religious celebrations in various points which they declared holy places. So, moreover, each Israeli settlement in the occupied territories has its own attached military force protecting and guarding it. Each hilltop outpost of young settlers who are engaging in pogroms against their Palestinian neighbors has got a platoon, at least, of Israeli soldiers protecting and guarding them. So there's quite a lot of Israeli forces mobilized, but they are engaged in protecting and defending and guarding the settlers. Of course, it took quite a long time for these troops to be transported to where they were needed in the south. And they were not even prepared or trained to engage in the kind of fighting that was necessary. I mean, the last exercise, as I mentioned, that Israel conducted with this kind of scenario was in 7 years ago, 2016. And since then, the focus was on annexation of the West Bank, of suppressing the resistance there, etc., etc. How it will unfold in the next few days is not clear. Certainly, Israel is going to heavily attack the biggest concentration camp in the world, that is the Gaza Strip. It has already started doing it, bombarding high-rise buildings and other civilian targets. Of course, the civilian casualties that Israel will cause in the Gaza will far outnumber the civilian casualties caused by the Hamas onslaught. Whether this will spread to other fronts in the immediate or in the intermediate future is anybody's guess. It is not clear how far it will go. I will also make another comment. Paradoxically, Israel is interested in not annihilating Hamas. What is the alternative? If Hamas is completely destroyed, who is going to govern Gaza? The only alternative is direct Israeli rule over Gaza. This will pin down a huge number of troops in order to police the 2.25 million Palestinians imprisoned in this ghetto. And will cost Israel an enormous amount in both financial terms and in morale. This has been proved long ago, before in the period that led to the first Intifada in the 1980s. So while an Israeli land incursion into the Gaza Strip is perfectly possible and could well happen, to remain in control, direct control of the Gaza Strip is not a convenient or feasible option for the Israeli colonial regime. So it's hazardous to make a guess as to what is actually going to happen, but I believe that a most probable scenario is Israeli incursion, land incursion into the Gaza Strip, with the view of destroying as much as possible, killing as many Palestinians as possible, and then withdrawing and declaring that revenge has been exacted. There is also another complication that Hamas has managed to take prisoner quite a number of Israeli soldiers and also take hostage a substantial number of Israeli civilians. An Israeli land incursion or heavy bombing of Gaza will put these Israelis at danger, which is a consideration that cannot have escaped the mind of the present criminal government of Israel. As to the longer run, I think while in the short run, as I've said, this is a clear success, victory for Hamas, as Israeli journalists have pointed out. This is not the balance of the outcome in the more distant future. I think I will have to repeat a prediction that I made and mentioned it previously also in the beginning of this talk, and that is further escalation of repression and resistance is inevitable. And in the longer run, at least from the Israeli point of view, there is a possible way out of it, and the way out of it is to get rid of the problem by ethnic cleansing. This is a long-held dream of Zionist planners, and it has been explicitly advocated by ministers in the present government. It is not a projection that you come to by making a logical analysis of the balance of forces. It is explicitly what they are driving it. It has been repeated, especially by the more, let us say, the more explicit cerebral member of the Messianic Zionist gang in the Israeli cabinet, Bezalel Smotrich. I mean, Ben Gvir behaves more like a thug. Bezalel Smotrich is more like an evil planner, and he is on record explicitly in advocating facing the Palestinians with a choice: either you accept subservient presence in Palestine, or will know how to deal with you. And he's not more than hinting at ethnic cleansing. Okay. This is certainly on the cards. Whether they will manage to actually carry it out is anybody's guess, but this is what is driving the present Israeli gang in the cabinet. Have I left any? Well, perhaps I should mention how should we sort of politically relate to this war. You will hear a lot of people saying, well, you know, Hamas is a reactionary force. Look at the way they slaughter civilians. I think we should look at it in the way that history looks at such arguments. Let us say, the fact that anti-colonial resistance movement don't behave like ethical, gentle people is not new. Let me mention one or two cases. First of all, the colonization of North America. The American Declaration of Independence mentions the indigenous people as merciless Indian savages. They were certainly guilty of killing a large number of civilian American settlers. Yet, in retrospect, who do you side with the colonial settlers or with the Native Americans? I think that is a question worth asking. Let me also mention the KLFA. You were perhaps wondering what KLFA stands for. It stands for the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, better known as the Mau Mau. They were the resistance movement to British colonialism in Kenya. It is estimated that they were responsible for the murder of nearly 2,000 civilians. Who do you side with? The British colonial regime, which of course was guilty of many more murders, I mein, incomparably more, and of various unspeakable atrocities. We don't side with them, but we side with KLFA historically. The FLN in Algeria was responsible for, it is estimated, for about 16,000 civilian murders. Who do you side with, the French colonial regime or the Algerian FLN? I think we should draw the right conclusions from this and apply the same kind of standard to the present conflict.